The Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Meghan Vankosky. She's a research scientist in the Field Crop Entomology Department with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Dr. Vankosky, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Hey, great for you to join us. I'm doing fantastic. So tell us about your work that you do at the research station there in Saskatoon.
Sure. So I'm an entomologist. I focus on research of pests that affect field crops, mostly oilseeds and pulses, and I am the co-chair of the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network.
Okay, so let's hear a little bit about the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. Growers, hear about it, but maybe they don't fully understand some of the work that's being done.
Certainly. Well, it's evolved over a long time. The network is over 20 years old. It was officially started by Owen Olfert in the 90s as a way to bring together experts in entomology across the prairies at a time when not a lot of new entomologists were being hired into research scientist positions or positions with the provinces. So we were losing expertise, but we still needed to be able to keep an eye out for what was happening in terms of insect pest outbreaks across the prairie provinces. So the network was developed to kind of fill that gap and to address some of those issues. So what we do today is we help oversee and coordinate surveys for 6 or 7 different insect pests, depending on the year, across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We develop maps that show the distribution and relative abundance of those pests, as well as some forecast maps for so that we can predict what's going to happen with populations between years. And then we also we produce weekly updates during the growing season, so anyone can subscribe to receive the weekly update, and it gives an idea of what's happening with insect pests across the 3 provinces on a weekly basis during the growing season. And then we also use historical data that we've collected as a network in order to build models so that we can predict what's happening with insect pests during the year and between years. Now, that's just kind of a quick, short summary because we do an awful lot.
Yeah, no kidding, and important work. So from a data collection standpoint, I would assume that growers or cooperators are a super important part of this process. Definitely.
So we're a very collaborative network in terms of who's participating. We're led by, currently by myself. I'm a scientist with Ag Canada, Saskatoon. We found that it works best to have kind of a federal government lead, and then we work with the provincial entomologists in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So they help oversee and coordinate surveys in each of the 3 provinces. And so we work with agronomists and the ag fieldmen in Alberta. Anyone who wants to host a trap is welcome to participate and share data with us. We provide the tools, they provide the data. So there's a lot of people involved across the whole of the prairies to collect this kind of data.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Cabbage seed pod weevil survey?
Sure. So the Cabbage seed pod weevil survey is kind of an interesting one because we leverage it to also collect some information on beneficial insects in canola fields. What we do every year is we conduct a survey where we collect sweep net samples from the edges of canola fields, and then we count the number of weevils that we find in those samples so that we can estimate the number of weevils per sweep. And then we take all that data and we put it into a map that shows the distribution of cabbage seed pod weevil in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They're just starting to show up in Manitoba, so our map is really just focused on Alberta and Saskatchewan right now.
And what kind of information have you gotten on beneficials from that survey?
So because we catch a lot of insects in those sweep net samples, so what we've been trying to do is separate out some of the different functional groups, so the pests versus the beneficial insects versus the pollinators, which are also beneficial. So what I've done in the last few years is we actually have a summary of how many different predators and parasitoids and pollinators we found in those samples. And very slowly, we're working to identify those insects to the species level so that we have a better idea of what the community structure of beneficial insects is in canola fields.
Yeah, I always find it amazing, and I shouldn't be amazed at this point, but I'll admit that I am. Just you look at a field, and you see the top of that canopy, and you're like, oh, field looks really good. And you don't think about the ecosystem that is living inside of that canopy. It truly is fascinating.
The diversity is very impressive, especially as the fields get more mature into flower. So one of the kind of anecdotal things that I found is that we find a lot more insects in our sweeps after the crop is flowering than when it's just very early into the flowering stages.
Yeah, makes sense. What about the wheat midge survey?
Right. So the wheat midge survey is one that we do in the fall. So we collect soil cores for this out of wheat fields, and then we wash all the soil to collect the wheat midge cocoon. So the wheat midge actually overwinter in a cocoon stage, and then in the spring, once it rains, those cocoons, the pupae or the larvae come out of the cocoons and then finish their development and then pupate, and then we get the emergence of the adults. So in the fall, we do a survey to count how many cocoons there are in the soil. We also dissect them to figure out how many of those are parasitized, and then we use those numbers to create a map that actually is a forecast map for wheat midge going into the next growing season. So in this past year, we actually found that our wheat midge populations were a little bit healthier in certain areas than they had been in previous years, probably because we started to get moisture just at the right time in the past growing season. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with wheat midge populations in 2020.
Yeah, and growers know that every year is different. So, having the science in place, the surveys in place, to put together an accurate forecast of what the pressures are going to be in the year ahead, that's critical information for growers.
I think so, and we put a lot of effort into getting the biological information that we need to really understand what affects the growth and development and population establishment and growth of these insect pests. So a big part of what the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network kind of does in the background is we use all this historical data to develop models so that we can predict what's going to happen during the season based on the climate or the weather in different areas. So we try to share the best predictive information that we can based on what we know about the biology and the life history of these insect pests and of their parasitoids and their predators. The maps are definitely regional, so they're meant to help growers and agronomists time their effort in the field to scout for these pests.
Do you have any other surveys that you're doing that you want to chat about?
Well, we also conduct annual surveys for grasshoppers, for pea leaf weevil, for Bertha armyworm, and for wheat stem sawfly. And in the last few years, in association with the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, we've been putting out a series of pheromone-baited traps for swede midge. We don't currently have swede midge on the prairies based on our trap results, but they could be a potentially devastating pest of canola production here. So we're keeping our eye out for them in conjunction with our other survey activities.
And the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, you have a new website out. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Well, we do have a new website. It's still kind of in the final stages of development, so we're planning on launching it in spring of 2020. What we're going to do, kind of associated with that launch, is all of the maps and all of the maps showing the forecast results from last year, from 2019. We usually post those around this time in the spring so that people can take a look at them going into the next growing season. So our plan is to post these maps online on our blog, but also encourage people then to go to the website and resubscribe to our weekly updates through the website. So we're very excited to have a website we've been using a blog for a few years, and it's been very useful, but it has certain limitations. So the website is very exciting.
Okay, so I go to the site, and that's where I can sign up to make sure I'm getting these weekly alerts.
Absolutely. Yeah. So right now with the blog, there's a little subscription. On the website, it's kind of right in your face. When you first go to the website, it's right there, so you can subscribe to the weekly updates. Once you've done that, then as we put out our weekly updates, everyone who's subscribed receives an email so they can link directly to that information.
I mentioned it earlier, and that was the fact that growers are an important part of this process. So how do growers get involved to make sure that they're putting their fields forward for sample collection?
That is an absolutely great question. Well, in Alberta, I know that Scott Mears and Shelley Barkley have a really excellent network of growers and agronomists that they rely on to volunteer their fields for access for surveys, and we certainly hope that people keep that up. In Saskatchewan, we're moving to a permission-based survey. In the past, we've been able to just kind of slip into the edges of fields to collect information, but due to the new trespass law in Saskatchewan, we need permission to access all private property. So we're looking this year for growers to please volunteer their land for these surveys. There is a web page that Saskatchewan growers can access to put in their information, what they're growing, where they're located, and essentially that's volunteering so that you can be contacted so that we can get that permission to access those fields. So please, if you are a grower in Saskatchewan, we'd really appreciate it if you would volunteer so that we can collect as much data as we can to have the best possible distribution and forecast maps.
Dr. Vankosky, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Pest and Predator podcast.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been great. Thank you.
The Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.